Graham Voss adjusted his silver cufflinks before he said a word. "Let's keep the message simple," he said, and the room went quiet. I sat at the edge of the conference table, my chair angled just outside the camera line. The screen behind him lit up with the campaign I had finished at 2 in the morning 3 days earlier. My sketches, my taglines, my layout, down to the exact spacing between the headline and the logo. He did not glance back at the screen once. He did not need to. He knew every line because he had watched me build it, slide by slide, for 6 straight nights. The clients leaned forward. One of them laughed at the right moment, the way people laugh when a joke lands exactly where it should. Graham smiled and let the silence hold for 2 full seconds before he continued. He never mentioned my name. Not once, not even in passing, not even as a courtesy. By the time the deck reached the final slide, the only name visible anywhere was his own, printed in small type in the corner, the way it always was. This was not new. It had simply become normal. A year earlier, after I closed a campaign for a beverage client, he changed exactly 1 slide before the client meeting. The title slide. My name came off. His went on. Nothing else in the deck was touched, not a single word, not a single pixel. When the campaign performed well, the agency sent the team a round of pizza for lunch. Graham took the bonus. I remember standing near the printer that day, holding a slice on a paper napkin, watching him accept congratulations from the account director like something he had personally carried across the finish line. Nobody in that room had watched me build the color palette 3 times over, rejecting version after version until it finally felt right. Nobody had watched the deadline nights, the coffee gone cold beside the keyboard, the small, private satisfaction of finishing something difficult. That satisfaction was mine. The applause never was. 6 months before that, during an internal review with the junior designers watching, he said it out loud, almost gently. "Celeste is excellent at following instructions. That's exactly what makes her so valuable." Maeve was in the room. So was Naomi. Nobody corrected him. I did not correct him either. I used to. Early on I tried. Each time, the answer came back the same way, delivered with the same patient, slightly disappointed tone. "You just misunderstood the process, Celeste. That's all this is." After enough repetitions, the sentence stopped feeling like an explanation and started feeling like a wall. I stopped walking into it. There was a promotion, 2 years in, that went as someone with half my portfolio and none of my client relationships. Leadership called it a team decision. I told myself it didn't matter, the way I told myself a lot of things didn't matter. Somewhere in those years I stopped trusting my own instincts in a room, waiting instead to see which idea Graham would choose to repeat back as his own before I let myself believe it was any good. My mechanical pencil sat beside my laptop, the way it always did, dark blue barrel, aligned perfectly with the edge of the table. I lined it up before every meeting without thinking about it anymore, the same way some people crack their knuckles or check their phone. It was a small ritual, and for years it meant nothing more than habit. Later it would mean something else entirely, but that morning it was only a pencil, waiting beside a laptop that did not yet know what it had recorded. The presentation ended. Applause followed, brief and warm, the kind reserved for work that clearly took real skill. Graham thanked the room. He thanked the account team. He thanked, by name, 2 people who had contributed almost nothing to the final version. When the client's export request went out later that afternoon, the design files carried no visible author field. The agency's template stripped that metadata automatically before anything left the building, a routine step nobody questioned, because nobody had a reason to. I gathered my things and walked out before anyone could ask what I thought of the presentation. I already knew the answer they wanted to hear, and I was tired of giving it to them. The agency's floor was open plan, glass walls on every side, so nothing that happened in a meeting stayed fully private. Junior designers watched Graham's presentations from their desks through the glass, half working, half absorbing the lesson without anyone stating it directly. The lesson was simple. Do the work. Let someone else carry it to the room. That was how careers moved here, and everyone under 30 learned it within their first year. Maeve caught my eye as I passed her desk. She said nothing, only clicked the cap of her marker once, then twice, a small nervous habit she repeated whenever a meeting left her uneasy. She had worked beside me for 4 years. She had seen every version of this same morning, different client, different campaign, same silver cufflinks, same sentence at the start. Neither of us had ever said the obvious thing out loud, not directly, not in a hallway where it could be overheard. Naomi stopped me near the kitchen, blocking my path just enough. "Great work today," she said, holding her notebook against her chest and shifting it from one arm to the other. She meant it kindly. She always meant things kindly. She also never once suggested that the credit should have gone anywhere other than where it landed, because suggesting that would have meant a conversation nobody in HR wanted to schedule. I made coffee I did not drink and returned to my desk. My monitor still had the campaign files open, 3 versions deep, each one time stamped by the system automatically the moment I saved it. Nobody looked at those timestamps. Nobody had a reason to, not yet. The agency's internal system logged every edit, every author, every minute spent inside a file, quietly, as a matter of routine, for reasons that had nothing to do with fairness and everything to do with billing. I thought, not for the first time, about how strange it was that the proof already existed. It had existed for years, sitting inside a server most people never opened, invisible unless someone went looking. I had never gone looking. I told myself it did not matter, that the work spoke for itself even when nobody credited it out loud. That afternoon, for reasons I could not name yet, the thought sat differently than it usually did. By 5 o'clock the office had mostly emptied. Graham stopped by my desk on his way out, cufflinks still perfectly straight, and said the presentation had gone well, hadn't it? I said yes. He nodded once, satisfied, and left without waiting for anything more, because he never expected anything more from me than agreement. There had been a moment 2 years back when I almost left. A recruiter from a smaller studio asked why my name wasn't on a case study for a campaign I had built start to finish. I had no good answer. I turned the offer down. Graham told me leaving now would be a mistake, that I was close to a promotion that never quite materialized. Close to it became a permanent condition, not a stage on the way to something else. I thought about that recruiter often, more than I admitted to anyone. Saying no had felt, at the time, like loyalty. Loyalty had never once been returned in kind. I stayed another hour after the office emptied, not working, just watching the lights switch off floor by floor as the cleaning crew moved through the building. 5 years is a long time to wait for something to change on its own. I had stopped expecting it to change. What I did not know yet, sitting there in the half-dark with my coat still on, was that the waiting was almost over. The ending would not come from anything I had planned at all. The next morning, Graham left the conference room in a hurry. A client from another account had called about a launch delay, and he took the call standing, already halfway out the door, his laptop still open on the table behind him. He did not stop to lock the screen. He never did when he was rushing, and lately he was always rushing toward something. I walked in a few minutes later to grab the charging cable I had left plugged into the wall outlet. The room was empty. His laptop sat exactly where he had left it, screen still lit, the browser open to an email he had not finished reading. The sender was the finance department. The subject line mentioned annual bonus allocations. I told myself I was only looking for my cable, and for a second that was even true. Then I saw the attachment open behind the email, a spreadsheet with 5 rows highlighted, each one tied to the agency's 5 largest contracts of the year. Every row listed the same name under creative lead, Graham Voss. A separate column beside it, smaller, easy to miss unless you were looking for it, read primary designer, Celeste Rowan. The bonus column showed figures with 6 digits, and every one of those figures sat next to his name, not mine. I did not touch the keyboard. I did not open anything further. I took out my phone and photographed the screen exactly as it was, the email header visible, a service timestamp, and an internal approval number printed along the bottom edge of the document. Then I stepped back, picked up my cable, and left the room before he came back. I sat back down at my own desk and stared at my monitor without seeing it. Somewhere down the hall, Graham's voice carried faintly through the glass, still on his call, still unaware that his laptop had said more in 90 seconds than 5 years of meetings ever had. I thought about deleting the photo. I thought about pretending I had never walked into that room at all. Neither thought lasted long. The photograph sat on my phone the rest of the day, unopened after that first look, unread by anyone but me. I did not feel triumphant. Triumph would come later, if it came at all, and it would not look like this. What I felt instead was closer to clarity, the kind that arrives quietly and does not leave once it has arrived. For the first time in a long while, I knew exactly what I was going to do next, even if I could not yet see the shape of the whole plan. I stopped arguing after that. Not out of defeat. Out of decision. Arguing had never worked, and I no longer needed it to work. What I needed was proof that could not be waved away with a sentence about misunderstanding the process. I reached out to Idris Hale first. He was the client company's corporate lawyer, someone I had worked alongside during contract reviews, always polite, always careful with language. We met at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the office, somewhere neither of us would run into anyone from the agency. He listened to the whole story without interrupting, took off his glasses halfway through, and slowly polished one lens with the corner of his shirt while I finished talking. "A photograph proves someone saw a document," he said, putting the glasses back on. "It doesn't prove authorship. If you want this to hold up anywhere that matters, you need a full chain. Drafts, timestamps, backups, correspondence, edit history, everything, not just the parts that feel dramatic." So I built the chain. Quietly over weeks, without telling anyone at the agency what I was doing. I pulled early drafts from my personal backup drive, files I had saved out of habit long before anyone suggested I might need them for anything. I requested my own edit history from the agency's internal system, framing the request as routine, something about organizing my portfolio. Nobody questioned it. Nobody had a reason to. I gathered internal emails where I had proposed concepts months before Graham ever presented them as his own. I gathered comment threads where art directors had responded directly to my notes, not his. I saved everything twice, once on a personal drive, once in a secure folder Idris set up for exactly this purpose. While I built the case, I also built an exit. A studio called Talia Brooks Creative had been quietly making a name for itself, small, independent, known for letting designers keep their names on their own work. I sent Talia a portfolio without mentioning where most of it had technically been produced. She called 2 days later and asked me to come in. Talia showed up to the interview in bright yellow sneakers, the kind that made her easy to spot across a crowded lobby. She flipped through my portfolio slowly, asking sharp, specific questions about process rather than results. Near the end, she looked up and said, "If these are really your work, I don't need anything else from you." I told her they were. She believed me without asking for proof, which felt strange after weeks of collecting exactly that. A contract arrived 2 weeks later, signed, dated, waiting in my inbox like something almost too ordinary to hold the weight it carried. Graham knew none of this. He had no reason to check my personal email, no reason to wonder why I left the office on time more often, no reason to notice the absence of overtime hours that used to fill half my week. I opened a separate bank account that month, one Graham's world had no visibility into. My current salary still landed in the old account, untouched, exactly as it always had. The new account existed only for what was coming, a quiet container waiting to be filled. I found an apartment closer to Talia's studio and signed the lease using my personal email address, through an agency that had nothing to do with my current employer. None of it crossed any system Graham could see into, not because I was hiding anything illegal, but because none of it was his business anymore, whether he realized that yet or not. I agreed on a start date with Talia, a full month out, enough time to give proper notice once I chose to give it. Nothing about the timeline required urgency. I had learned patience the hard way, across 5 years of watching my own ideas walk out of rooms wearing someone else's name. Graham noticed the change before he understood it. Not all at once. In pieces. I stopped correcting his small mistakes in shared documents, the kind I used to fix without being asked. I stopped answering messages after 7 in the evening, something I had done without complaint for years. I stopped reminding him about deadlines 2 days before they were due, a habit that had quietly kept half his projects on schedule. He started poking at his cufflinks more often, a small tell I had watched for years without naming it as one. "Everything all right?" he asked me one afternoon, standing near my desk with his arms crossed. "Yes," I said. "Just tired." He nodded, unsatisfied, and walked away without pushing further, because pushing further had never once occurred to him as necessary where I was concerned. Maeve noticed too, faster than Graham did. She caught me near the printer one afternoon and clicked the cap of her marker twice, a habit I had stopped counting after 4 years of watching it. She didn't ask what was happening. She only said, quietly, "I thought you'd never leave." I didn't answer directly. I told her nothing was decided yet, which was true in the narrowest possible sense, and false in every sense that mattered. The weeks moved forward in that same quiet rhythm. Documents assembled themselves into folders. Timestamps stacked into a timeline nobody at the agency had thought to protect against. Every edit I had ever made carried my username and the exact minute it happened. Nobody had built that system to prove anything. It just happened to prove everything once someone bothered to look. Somewhere in that 4th week, Idris added up the total figure across all 5 contracts, the actual number sitting behind 5 years of my own work carrying someone else's name. He read it out to me once, flatly, the way he read everything. I didn't ask him to repeat it. Some numbers only need to be heard once to change how a person breathes for the rest of the afternoon. There was a night, close to the end of that month, when I almost stopped. Not out of fear exactly. Out of a tired, familiar instinct to keep things smooth, the same instinct that had kept me quiet for 5 years. I sat with the folder open on my kitchen table and thought about how easy it would be to simply leave, take the new job, and let the whole thing fade without confrontation. I thought about it for exactly 1 evening. By morning the instinct had passed, and it did not come back. Idris reviewed the final folder line by line, cross-checking dates against the bonus spreadsheet from the photograph. "It's solid," he told me during our last meeting before the review. "More than solid." I asked him what came next. He said the next step wasn't really up to either of us anymore. It was up to whoever finally asked the right question in the right room, out loud, where it couldn't be quietly redirected afterward. I didn't know yet who would ask that question or when. I only knew, walking out of that meeting, that for the first time in 5 years I was ready for it. The evenings during those weeks looked ordinary from the outside. I cooked dinner. I watered the 2 plants on my windowsill. I answered texts from my sister about nothing important. Underneath that ordinary surface, a second life ran in parallel, quiet and exact, built one small task at a time. I labeled folders by date rather than by project name, a habit Idris suggested to keep everything neutral if anyone ever glanced at my screen by accident. I kept the mechanical pencil with me through all of it, in my bag rather than beside my laptop, out of sight during the day, present at night while I sorted files at my kitchen table. It had stopped meaning what it used to mean. It no longer felt like a marker of ideas that belonged to someone else the moment they left my hands. It felt, increasingly, like something that was simply mine, waiting for the rest of my life to catch up to that fact. Once, reviewing an early comment thread with Idris, he paused and asked if I was certain I wanted to go through with this. I told him I had been certain for 5 years. He nodded, satisfied, and kept working. Talia's contract sat in my inbox during all of this, a quiet counterweight to everything I was building against Graham. I read it over more than once, not because I doubted it, but because it was the first document in years that had my name on it without conditions attached. I signed it on a Sunday morning, alone in my kitchen, and felt the strange, specific relief of a decision that finally belonged only to me. By the 4th week, the folder Idris and I had built contained more than 60 documents, organized by contract, cross-indexed against the bonus spreadsheet, each piece small on its own and undeniable together. I read through it one final time the night before I planned to hand in my resignation letter, sitting alone at my kitchen table, feeling something that no longer resembled the nervousness it had started as. Graham asked me again that week if everything was all right, this time in the hallway outside the printer room, his voice lower than usual, almost uncertain. I told him yes, the same word I had given him before. He didn't push. He never did, not with me, because 5 years of never being pushed back on had convinced him he never needed to. I handed in my resignation letter on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks before the annual review meeting where the season's biggest campaigns would be presented to leadership and to the agency's largest client. I gave the standard notice period, nothing more, nothing that would draw attention to timing that mattered far more than it appeared to. Graham read the letter at his desk, cufflinks catching the light as he adjusted them once, then again, and told me the agency would be sorry to lose someone so reliable. I thanked him. I meant it less than he understood. That weekend, I walked through my new apartment for the first time with the keys still warm in my pocket, empty rooms waiting to be filled with furniture that belonged to nobody but me. I stood there a long moment doing nothing at all. For years, I had measured time by deadlines that carried someone else's name. Standing in that empty apartment, I measured it instead by how close the review meeting had gotten, 2 weeks, then 10 days, then 1. The annual review meeting filled the largest conference room in the building. Agency leadership sat along one side of the table. Owen Mercer, the marketing director for the agency's biggest client, sat across from them with 2 of his own colleagues. Naomi took a seat near the door, notebook balanced against her arm. Maeve sat 2 chairs down from me, closer to Graham than to me, though her eyes kept drifting my way. The whole creative team had been asked to attend. Graham opened with the year's flagship campaign, the same one from the presentation months earlier, polished now into a highlight reel of results. He spoke confidently, cufflinks straight, voice smooth in the way it always was when he stood in front of people who mattered. Owen tapped his fingers on the table 3 times, a habit I had noticed before without ever knowing what it meant. This time it meant something was about to shift. "Celeste," he said, turning toward me, "can I ask a professional question? I want to understand the actual thinking behind this identity system, the logic underneath it, not just the results." I answered without preparing anything in advance. I walked through the reasoning behind every choice, the color system, the typographic hierarchy, the decisions we had made and unmade during 3 separate rounds of revision. 2 minutes in, it was obvious to everyone in the room that I knew this project down to its smallest detail, in a way that had nothing to do with simply following instructions. Owen asked to see the development history, not the final deck. The actual process, start to finish. Idris, sitting quietly near the far end of the table as the client company's legal representative, took off his glasses and slowly polished one lens before he spoke. He said he happened to have a prepared summary available, given ongoing due diligence on the account, and passed a bound folder down the table. Inside were timestamps, authorship records, comment histories, and the earliest concept sketches, each one dated weeks before Graham had ever shown them to anyone. Maeve clicked the cap of her marker twice, faster than usual, and set it down without picking it up again. Naomi stopped moving her notebook from arm to arm and simply held it still, watching the room instead. One by one, the people around the table stopped looking at Graham and started looking at the pages in front of them. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Someone from leadership pulled up the agency's internal project system on the main screen at Owen's request, opening the changelog directly, the same log that had quietly recorded every edit for years without anyone thinking to check it. The screen showed usernames beside every version, dates beside every file, my name appearing first over and over, weeks and sometimes months ahead of any date Graham could claim. Graham reached up and adjusted his cufflinks, the motion smaller than usual, almost unconscious. "Let's keep the message simple," he said, so quietly it barely reached the far end of the table. This time nobody laughed. This time it sounded less like direction and more like something closer to a plea, a sentence with no weight left underneath it. Owen looked at the folder, then at the screen, then at Graham. He asked, evenly, whether Graham wanted to explain the discrepancy himself, right there, in front of everyone. Graham opened his mouth. Nothing came out. His hand moved halfway toward his cufflinks and stopped, hanging in the air, forgetting itself. For 5 years I had watched that gesture fill every silence he ever stood in. This time it just hung there, doing nothing, because for the first time he had nothing to fill the silence with. I sat still through all of it, hands folded on the table, saying nothing further unless asked. I didn't need to say anything further. The documents were already doing what 5 years of conversations never had. Someone from leadership finally spoke, choosing careful, procedural words about needing to review the situation internally before making any statements. Owen didn't accept that framing. He said the review could happen internally, but the client relationship would be paused until it was resolved, effective that afternoon. His two colleagues began gathering their materials before he had even finished the sentence, a small, coordinated motion that made the decision feel already final. Graham tried once more, his voice steadier this time, an attempt at composure. He said there had clearly been a misunderstanding about how credit was documented internally, that titles like creative lead didn't always reflect the full team's contribution, that this was simply how the industry worked. Idris, still holding the folder, said quietly that the bonus records didn't list a team. They listed one name, repeated 5 times, against contracts worth a specific, documented amount. He didn't raise his voice either. He didn't need to. Naomi finally spoke, addressing leadership rather than Graham directly. She said, carefully, that she had witnessed some of the internal comments referenced in the documents herself during past reviews, and that she could confirm the timeline if it became necessary. It was the first time in 5 years I had heard her say anything that placed her on a side. Maeve didn't speak. She didn't need to. She had already said what she meant to say, weeks earlier, near the printer, in 4 quiet words that neither of us had brought up again since. The meeting ended without a clean resolution, the way meetings like that usually do. No one announced a verdict in the room. Owen and his colleagues left first, their expressions unreadable, their departure itself a kind of statement. Agency leadership stayed behind, already speaking in the low, clipped tones people use when a conversation has moved past anything that can be planned for in advance. I gathered the folder Idris handed back to me, the same one that had taken weeks to build, now finished with its purpose, at least for that room. Graham remained seated after everyone else stood, staring at the table, his cufflinks catching the overhead light one last time as his hand drifted toward them out of pure habit, nothing left underneath the gesture but reflex. I walked out without waiting to see what he would do next. Some doors don't need to be closed on purpose. They simply stop being relevant the moment you stop standing in front of them. Graham found me 3 days later, outside the building where I no longer worked, waiting near the entrance like he had been standing there a while. He looked different than I had ever seen him, no confidence in his shoulders, no easy command in his voice. He asked if we could talk, if there was a way to make this right, some arrangement that didn't involve lawyers or clients or anything permanent. Leadership had placed him on administrative leave the day after the review meeting, pending an internal investigation that everyone already understood the outcome of. The client relationship Owen managed stayed frozen, and 2 smaller accounts had quietly followed, their contacts citing timing rather than reasons, though the reasons weren't hard to guess. None of that came from me directly. I hadn't spoken to a single client since the meeting. The documents had simply kept moving once they left my hands. True things tend to, once nobody is left to redirect them. I didn't answer him right away. I thought about the pencil sitting in a box of my belongings back at my new apartment, no longer lined up beside anyone's laptop, no longer waiting for a meeting that would erase its owner's name from the finished work. I thought about every version of this conversation I had imagined over 5 years, all of them louder than this, all of them ending in something closer to shouting. None of those imagined versions had prepared me for how quiet the real one would actually be. He said he could talk to leadership, smooth things over, make sure this didn't follow either of us too far. He said we could keep the message simple. His hand drifted toward his cufflinks out of old habit, then stopped halfway, as if even that small gesture no longer knew what it was reaching for. I told him 5 years was long enough. 5 years, selling my ideas as his. Now he could go build one of his own, and find out if he had it in him. I said it plainly, without raising my voice, the same way I had answered every question in that conference room days earlier. He didn't have anything to say back. The phrase that used to open every important conversation for him had nothing left to stand on. Not with me. Not anymore. I turned and walked toward the train station, and he didn't follow. 2 weeks later, at Talia's studio, a new client sat across the table for the first kickoff meeting of my new role. Talia introduced me the way she introduced everyone who worked with her. Lead concept designer, Celeste Rowan, she said. Nothing else attached to the sentence, no qualifier, no shared credit line splitting the room's attention in half. It was the first time in 5 years someone had said my name out loud in a professional room and let it stand there, complete, belonging to nobody else. I kept the pencil on my new desk after that, lined up against the edge exactly the way I always had, out of habit that no longer needed breaking. It didn't mean what it used to mean. It never would again. So here's the question I keep sitting with, and maybe you will too. Was it fair to let the truth end a career that had spent 5 years standing on someone else's work? I think about that more than I expected to. If you enjoyed this story, hit like and subscribe, and tell me honestly what you would have done in that conference room.